Hello, everyone. Today, I am very, very happy to welcome back onto the show one of my favorite guests, Gwendolyn Kiste. How you doing, Gwendolyn?
Just fine. Thank you so much for having me back. I'm so excited.
Do you mind giving yourself a quick introduction? I would read an introduction, but I always manage to butcher them somehow.
Make the people do it themselves. I agree. I'm Gwendolyn Kiste. I am a three-time Bram Stoker award-winning author, as well as a Lambda Literary Award winner. I have written The Rust Maidens, Reluctant Immortals, Pretty Mary's All in a Row, Enter Smile Will Untether the Universe, Bone Set in Feathers, and my latest that we'll be talking about today, The Haunting of Velkwood. And I also write a lot of short fiction and short nonfiction. So yeah.
Yay. So, welcome back, and thank you so much for coming back onto the show. I believe this is the third time I've talked to you.
Yeah, that sounds right. Yeah, because the one was about Vastarian. That was so much fun. And it
Yeah,
was like
that was awesome.
the two of us and John Paget. That was just amazing. That was so much fun. I think
Yeah.
that was the last time I was on the show. So, yeah.
Yeah, that was really incredible. I really absolutely loved that conversation. I'm really sad that Vestarian is going away now.
I am too. I mean, I'm happy that John knows what he needs and what he needs to do as a publisher and for his own, work and for himself. But yeah, I think for the industry, it's definitely a loss. That filled a
It is.
wonderful, wonderful niche for horror, unusual horror and weird fiction. So yeah, I'm sad, but I'm glad we had it while we had it because it was an
Yeah.
amazing publication.
We do have others, but like other magazines, but yeah, absolutely that's going to be a
Mhm.
huge loss in the industry. I totally agree. So speaking on a bigger note or a happier note, I should say, you recently released The
Yes.
Haunting of Velkwood, and and I believe you're going on a book tour. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm in the middle of it now. I had my launch party in Pittsburgh on Tuesday. The book came out on Tuesday, and I'm going to be in Cleveland next week and Atlanta the week after. And then I've got some virtual stops, and I'm going to be in Harrisburg and back in Pittsburgh. So it's kind of like a little bit all over. A lot in my area, but definitely going to some other places too. So yeah.
Cool. I always take like book tours as sort of like musicians when they go on tour, and you got to wonder, like, they're playing the same songs every night, right? I got to wonder, do you get tired of like all the questions about like your one book that you just released, like telling the same story the 10th time?
I don't. And I always try to like bring something new into it and try to be like, okay, I can answer this with like, you don't want to give a totally different answer because if somebody like follows it across to like, why did she just give a completely different answer? But maybe bringing something in that I hadn't thought to bring in before is
Yeah.
always like a fun thing of like, oh, is this an anecdote maybe I haven't told? But I'm just happy people are interested in my work. Every time I'm interviewed, it always feels like, it's just a really cool thing that people care. I feel like when you first start out as a writer, you're like, is anyone going to listen? Is anyone going to read this? So when people are reading it and are asking you questions about it, I'm always just grateful. I'm like, yay, this is
Yeah.
awesome.
You know what? That is great because like I've been doing stuff like this for a long time, and it took years and years before anyone started paying attention.
Yeah.
Because I did a podcast. The first place I talked to you was the Darkness Dwells podcast, and
Yes.
and that didn't go anywhere, that show. I got like maybe 10 downloads every episode, and that was it. And
Mhm.
that was like for a 3 or 4 year period. And then I started doing this on YouTube, and it finally started getting some traction. So I I know exactly, well, not exactly what you mean, but I know where you're coming from.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
So,
before we start with the Haunting of Velkwood, I want to something talk about something that's sort of adjacent to that. And you recently released an essay with crimereads.com, I think it is.
yeah.
Um, and it's called "The Terror Around the Corner: The Enduring Appeal of the Suburban Gothic."
Yes.
And I kind of laugh at myself because because I was telling you just before I hit the live button um, that I didn't know suburbia gothic was a thing until I read that article, and then it was like, holy cow, this is totally a thing. Like,
No, it's okay. I feel like up until a few, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I didn't know either until I was kind of like doing a deep dive into the Gothic and it showed up as like a subset of the Gothic. And I'm like, and in the same way I think you said, it's like, oh, of course. Then your mind starts going to all the different examples of it. So I kind of love the fact that the Gothic can sometimes almost hide in plain sight. I think that's a really neat aspect of the Gothic because when I was younger and knew what the Gothic was, it always seemed like it had to be castles and it had to be some remote place and it had to be dark, shadowy places. Oh, thank you, Katrina. I really appreciate that.
Katrina Brown commented, "I really enjoyed the Haunting of Velkwood," for the podcast listeners.
Yes, for the podcast listeners, yes.
So
And so I really like that about the Gothic is that you actually find out that it's very much broader than what you maybe initially think that it is. So I think that's cool.
yeah, that kind of leads into my next question. What are the less obvious differences between suburban Gothic versus a more traditional Gothic story?
The first thing that comes to mind for me, and it wouldn't necessarily be true, but I just think almost like I have a filmmaking background, so sometimes I still think a little bit in film terms. And I think lighting. I think in more traditional Gothic, it's darker. There's more shadows. Whereas with suburban Gothic, you're going to be in a place, there's probably street lights. I mean, that seems like the most basic thing, but there's street lights. There's probably, suburban Gothic obviously is newer than a lot of other Gothic. It's going to be probably in the last 50 to 60, maybe 70 years now. I feel like suburbia as an idea really came about in America in particular in like the 1950s. But obviously you're going to have indoor lighting, right, in houses in suburbia. So they're going to be a lot more brightly lit. And so that's something that I think of. And then again, I already touched on it's kind of a lot more modern. And so you're going to have more modern amenities and things like that. It's not maybe going to be that kind of candlelit Gothic that we sort of associate with the Gothic. But sometimes that can be really interesting because it can kind of subvert expectations. It can still be really creepy, even something that's brightly lit. I always think when I think of brightly lit horror, I always think of Phantasm, which I don't necessarily know is suburban Gothic. It might be. It might be.
Could be.
It's almost more small town Gothic if you want to go. But I always remember as a kid watching that because it always seemed to be on cable when I was growing up, and how scary it was, even though it was very, very brightly lit. So I think sometimes being able to see things can almost be scarier because it's like, wow, like you don't expect it. There's a kind of subversion of it.
One thing that you talk about in the essay a lot is a surrealistic nature to these
Mhm.
stories. Not all of them, of course, but
Mhm.
I think
Mhm.
that suburban Gothic allows more for surrealistic
Mhm.
uh, storytelling technique. And can you say what it is that adds that where you can actually add surrealism to a suburban Gothic story?
Yeah, I was asked this recently, like, what is it about suburbia that's so scary? And one of the things that immediately jumps to mind for me is they're unnatural communities. They're not communities like cities or rural areas. People tend to build where there are resources. So you're building in a city because you're by a river. I think of Pittsburgh, that's where, I live near. It formed because of the three rivers. There's a natural sense as to why people ended up there. In rural areas, it's because there's farmland. Suburbia doesn't do that. It's almost a surreal idea to begin with that we plan a community somewhere that there's no resources around. We just say, okay, that's where we're going to build. And so, because of that, there's an unnatural quality to suburbia right from the get go. And then also, it tends to be the idea of why they're building away from things is because they want to be away from people. They want to build this allotment because they want it to be exclusive. So, there's a kind of like us versus them mentality that you can kind of build in when you're working with the suburban Gothic. One filmmaker that I mention in the article that I feel like has done suburban Gothic so well is David Lynch. I think Blue Velvet and Twin Peaks. And you could also say they're kind of small town Gothic. You could argue that too. But they definitely have those qualities of suburban Gothic where they're very brightly lit. You're dealing with these communities that very much keep people out and have their own kind of sense of rules. And so I feel like that's like a great example of what you can do with suburban Gothic and the surrealism that he's able to just build into it, just this everyday life, these kind of rules, almost sometimes unspoken rules that you're supposed to follow, like etiquette rules, quote unquote. So yeah, I think that's such a thing, like the existential dread of suburbia, I think is very real.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. One thing I really enjoyed about it, something that I always talked about, and this is why your essay really hit home for me, is that suburbia tends to, like you talk about light, and I would say that suburbia almost wears a mask.
Yes.
to show all the good things, and you only see all the good things on the surface, but there's closed doors and there's garages and there's things being buried in the backyard that you don't see, you
Yes.
know what I mean? And
Yes.
and the idea of home supposed to be a safe place where
Yeah.
you retreat to, but it's not
Mhm.
always the safe place. Uh,
No,
yeah,
no, and I love that idea of suburbia wears a mask. I very much agree with that. It's supposed to be perfect. So yeah. Yes,
yeah,
I talk about the something Katrina says, yes, that opening shot in Blue Velvet with the ants.
yeah,
Yes, I talk about it in the essay because I feel like that is such a quintessentially suburban Gothic image of like we are above ground and then someone has a heart attack and collapses or has some kind of like horrible medical thing happen and he's collapsed and he's just laying there and nobody's coming to his aid right away because nobody even knows it's happened. And then we go below the surface and we start seeing all of this like rot and then insects and everything below the surface. And it just feels to me that's if you want one image of the suburban Gothic, it's that little sequence in Blue
yeah.
Velvet that's just so perfect.
And then there's an ear.
Yes, and
That's
then there's
our
the
ear.
ear. Like the ear is right after that. I don't
Yeah,
think it's the very next thing though, because I thought it was, but I rewatched it when I was writing the essay. I think it's a couple scenes later, but yeah, the ear is right after that. And I
yeah,
find that so interesting too. It's like, all these things. Oh, it's supposed to be so nice, but it's like, oh boy, there's a lot of darkness like hiding right in plain sight.
yeah, absolutely. That's what I love about a suburban gothic is it sort of removes the mask,
Yeah.
and it
Yeah.
shows you like, and there's some very clever movies that do it. Some movies you might not even think are doing that, like Steve Martin's L.A. Story. Have you ever seen that?
I've never seen that. I will have to put that on my to watch list. I've never seen that.
It's
I've
not, I
heard of
wouldn't say it completely fits, but it has that suburbia feel where everything
it.
is perfect. He's, like, totally making fun of it. Like, in the morning, you see everyone at the same time going out to get their newspaper, and they're all
Mhm.
doing, like, a slow dance to do it. Steve Martin, he's just making fun of it. He doesn't really go into the dark stuff, you know? He's
Yeah.
just sort of, sort of a slapstick sort of thing, but there's that, and there's The Burbs,
Yes,
there's
yes.
so many things, and I
I
absolutely love
haven't
it, but
seen the I haven't seen The Burbs since I was a kid, and I don't think I appreciated it. I need to
and it
rewatch it
probably
because
disturbed you back then, yeah,
I think I would get into it now.
yeah, but now we have, The Haunting of Velkwood, and
Yes.
this really fits into that as well because, first of all, I wanna thank you for getting me the ARC for this.
Oh, yeah.
I read it about a month ago, and I kinda regretted that at first. I was like, "I What if I start forgetting bits of the story between now and when I talk to Gwendolyn?" But that never happened. This story sticks
Oh.
like rice in your esophagus.
That is an amazing analogy.
But I mean that in the best possible way too. So can you tell us what, The Haunting of Elkwood is about?
Yes, absolutely. It is about a haunted neighborhood that one day turned into a ghost. The whole neighborhood is now behind a veil that's basically impenetrable, and all the people are trapped inside, except for the three girls who got out the night before. They went back to college, and they are the only ones who were able to cross the boundary. And now it's 20 years later, and one of them has decided that she is going to go back and try to kind of settle the score with the ghosts and try to reach her baby sister who has been trapped inside all these years.
Yeah, and I've heard people compare it to a haunted house story a lot, but, it's more like a haunted street, and the street
Yeah,
is Elkwood, and
yeah.
I really enjoyed that because, actually, before I get into that, I wanna talk about your influence for this because I know that you got the idea for, The Haunting of Velkwood from a photography book called Suburbia by Bill Owens,
Yes.
and, you mention it in your essay, but you've mentioned it in interviews as well.
Mhm.
Um, so, this book has influenced a lot, like, it's
Yes.
influenced Virgin Suicides and Edward
Mhm.
Scissorhands. I believe this book was published in the '70s or late '60s?
I think 73, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay. And, I was wondering, like, I tried looking up this book, and all
Mhm.
you can find is maybe some clips here and there of what was in that book, but
Mhm.
I know you've, actually been able to look at it, so what
Mhm.
was it about Suburbia that inspires so many things?
The pictures and the captions were so great because at once they feel like they're very quintessentially American, very quintessentially suburbia, but at the same time, there's something very interesting and strange in some of them. And and some of the captions they can be very banal, but at the same time, some of them have like this kind of odd insight into living in suburbia, especially at that time. And so there was like how much it was a slice of Americana, but also how much it had this kind of little bit of existential dread kind of simmering beneath the surface. And especially then finding out, how I found it to begin with was because I'm such a big fan of Sofia Coppola's The Virgin Suicides. And so, I mean, I brought that in to the situation. Of course, I brought that into looking at all of the pictures, but then also finding out, Edward Scissorhands, the neighborhood in there cited as an inspiration. Close Encounters of the Third Kind actually used it as like, I think, inspiration for costumes. So
Yeah.
it's a very interesting book as in terms of the life it's had, kind of being almost on like a mood board before people had like online mood boards, right? Back when mood boards were actually things that people physically would have or cut out or anything. But yeah, and it feels so of its time, and yet there's something timeless about some of the things as well.
Yeah, from the pictures I could find that were in that book, it really shows, the mask that I was talking
Mhm.
about, like, that's all
Mhm.
you see is the mask, but I think there's a inherent creepiness in that
Yeah.
because we all know, being human, that's just the
Mhm.
surface level.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely, absolutely. And yeah, I do think the photography book is sadly out of print, but I was able to find like a copy on, I forget where, maybe Half Price Books or something. I
yeah.
think mine might even be autographed. I actually think it
Ah,
might be I think it might have an autograph. I'm not positive of that. And who knows if it's authentic, right? Even if it has an autograph, like there's no
yeah,
provenance. But yeah, it's really neat. I was really glad that I was able to get a copy. It was right at the beginning of the pandemic, and trying to find things to keep myself busy while staying at home unexpectedly. So it was a nice thing to kind of spend time with, especially since it's about people being together, right? And at that moment, people were not together. So there was probably some kind of interesting juxtaposition in choosing that book at that time.
yeah. I like, all the pictures of people in there, they're all smiling and looking happy. It almost looks like a dream, but then I guess that's what in a sense, that's what it's trying to sell is the American dream.
And then some of them, like if you read the whole book, then some of them, I remember there's a picture, I'm pretty sure, of a woman, and like all the dishes are just piling up. And she says something to the effect of, like, I don't see why I should be doing the dishes when I think something about Vietnam, because I think Vietnam was still going on then.
Oh,
So
yeah.
what was interesting about the book is when you kind of look at it as a whole and you see the captions, sometimes they're kind of discordant with what you expect, and then it'll go back to being something that is exactly what you expect. So it's almost like you've got this interesting thing that, like, it'll all of a sudden be something you're like, oh whoa, that's not what I was thinking this was going to be, and then it would go back to something like, okay, it's like a block party or whatever. So I really liked that, and I definitely felt like, looking at it, it was how I imagined my book, The Rust Maidens, in that neighborhood to look, even though I hadn't ever seen
Yeah.
this book or these pictures at the time. So it was interesting to find something that I'm like, oh, wow, this really reminds me of a neighborhood that I created, and so you're kind of hitting on something that feels very, very real and very universal somehow.
Yeah. You're absolutely right. I didn't equate this to the Rust Maidens, but because mostly I've been kind of obsessing over The Haunting of Velkwood, but you're absolutely right. And The Rust Maidens is another brilliant novel. I really enjoyed that for its look at the steel belt and
Mhm.
how that destroyed so many like companies going out of business or
Yeah.
moving to Mexico or China or wherever because it's cheaper and how that affected the American people who are trying to, make their American dream come alive.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I grew up in Ohio, and so I can't remember when they were all going out by and large. That mostly happened before I can really remember, even before I was born. But I definitely saw kind of like the abandoned factories or heard people talking about having lost their jobs and things like that. There was still one steel mill kind of close to where I grew up, about half an hour away, that was still open until I was like finishing high school. But even then, people lost their jobs eventually. So it just kind of kept going. And, yeah, and so that was, I don't actually think I've been back in Cleveland since writing The Rust Maidens, but I'm going to be literally this week. And I do think that's the first time I've been back in like 5 or 6 years. So that'll be interesting to like go back now. I went to college there, I went to undergrad in Cleveland. So I've spent a lot of time there, but not for a while. So it'll be fun to finally go back because I do miss it. I do love it there. And I do think Cleveland is a really neat city. I think Pittsburgh's a really neat city. And I do think they've worked hard to revitalize themselves and kind of turn that around. So
Yeah, for sure. Um, I want to talk about the street of Velkwood, because there's so much going on with that street. um, it kind of shimmers in a misty, foggy sort of way when you're outside of it, and I was really
mhm.
impressed by that. It gives you like goosebumps just knowing that you can't really go in there, right? Because it's been shielded off from reality.
Yeah.
Um, I that kind of right there, I'm just like, huh? I'm like, I'm like a meerkat when something like that happens.
I love that.
But um, it made me think honestly of memory because obviously like something happens there,
Mhm.
right? And
Mhm.
it looks
Mhm.
it reminded me of looking back into your like as a human looking back into your own memory and how it kind of shimmers too. And but when you go back into your memory and you really dig in there, you find that's where some surrealism comes about because you could experience the same situation with somebody else, but they
Mhm.
remember it completely different than you do.
Mhm.
I was wondering if was this something you were aware of while writing it, or did you have to work at this and like you chip away and find that there's this little nugget here?
I was thinking a lot about how this place did operate like a memory because I think a lot about memory because I agree that people don't remember things the same at all. And I've had that a lot in my own life of things that I remember very clearly, and somebody else might be like, well, I remember it this way, I remember it that way. And we want to think about memory almost like you're rewinding a VHS tape. That might be an out of date comparison now, but we want to think, oh, you can just rewind it, go back into it, and you're like watching a movie. But that's not how memory works at all. Like you said, it's very misty, and you go into it and it's very surreal. And you might only be able to hold on to bits and pieces of it. Like you remember maybe where someone was standing, or what time of day it was, or whose house it was, or maybe one or two people who were there, but not everybody who was there. And I remember because my graduate degree is in psychology, and it's in social psychology. So it's specifically kind of things that, everybody experiences. And one of those things that come up so often is like, eyewitness testimony is terrible. We rely on it so much in the court system, but it's often not very good because memory isn't as accurate as we want to believe it is. Now, certainly some things you can rely on. There are certain things that, you can trust people on, but especially when it's from a long time ago and it's something that's highly emotional, it can be something, and even if it's not highly emotional, that, we don't remember things as exactly as we want to. It is
Yeah,
misty. It can be something that's very difficult to hold on to. And so that was definitely something I was thinking of when I was creating this neighborhood of it is misty, it is vague in a way, even though once she goes into it, it becomes at once more solid and not at all more solid at the same time of like dealing with what is the literal, if you're literally walking through your memories, what is that like?
yeah. And I really loved like when I don't want to spoil the story too much, but when Talitha, the main character, bridges that and goes across to the other
Yeah.
side, there is a certain surreality that we come
Yeah.
across, and it
Yeah.
made me think of so many different things. And I have like 2 points here to make. It made me think of Blue Velvet. It made
Okay.
me think of uh, a lot of these types of stories, like of Suburbia, right? Because
Mhm.
this is where we get into like that book of Suburbia, where everything is almost playing out as it should, and except there's like a really weird undercurrent going on,
Yeah.
below everything else. But the story itself is like incredibly original, and that's where I think comparisons come because I keep seeing people compare the Haunting of Velkwood to other things, and there's like a huge range of things that it's being compared to. It's like Neil McRobert from Talking Scared. He said it's like the Virgin Suicides meets the Langoliers. I could see the Virgin. Well, I guess I could see the Langoliers too, actually, now that I think about it. But I've heard it also compared to Silent Hill,
Mhm.
Annihilation, The Haunting of
Mhm.
Hill House,
Yeah.
the David Lynch I mentioned, amongst many others, where all these meet. do you think maybe all these forms of media collided into your unconscious mind and it just sort of spewed back out into The Haunting of Velkwood? Because like I said, it's so original that I think that's why there's so many people are trying to figure this book out, you know?
I love that. That makes me happy to hear. Thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, and I do think also because there is a degree of surrealism, anytime something has that surreal quality, it can be hard to compare it to anything because I think surrealism by itself is something that is a difficult comparison, even to other things that are surreal.
Yeah.
I do love the David Lynch comparisons. I'm a huge David Lynch fan, and I don't feel like his work has appeared as an inspiration in many of my other works. Like I don't really look back and say, "Oh, there's a Lynchian, comparison to Rust Maidens or Reluctant Immortals." I don't really feel that way. But as I was writing this, I don't know if initially I was like, yes, I want this to have a Lynchian feel, but it kind of naturally did. I'm like, okay, this is cool. Like that's just a fun thing to bring in because I am such a huge David Lynch fan. And I actually love the way I became a David Lynch fan was very slowly. It was like very slowly, then all at once. Like, I think I saw Blue Velvet, and the first time I saw it, I did not get it. I did not like it. I was like 18 or 19. I, like, I
I
don't
can
like
see
this
that.
movie. I wish so much I hadn't thrown this away. I wrote about it for like a cinema class I took and like wrote this like really scathing review. And I got like an A on the scathing review. And like, I don't feel that way at all. Like I took it way too much at face value that like not understanding kind of like the satire of it. And when I went back and watched it just a few years ago, I'd liked a lot of other David Lynch's stuff in between, but I still didn't like Blue Velvet, or so I thought. And my husband didn't really like it either, or so he thought. And we rewatched it, and right from like the opening shot is this weird log song because it's like a logging town and there's like some weird log song, I think. And we're like laughing hysterically right away. And we're like, okay, both of us right away are like, okay, I don't think we understood this the first time we saw it. And we rewatched it, and it was a very different experience. And so like I didn't like Blue Velvet, but I really liked Eraserhead. And then kind of went from there and watched, like I really loved Mulholland Drive. And then I didn't necessarily love Lost Highway, but I would think about it a lot. And then it grew on me. And it took me a while to get to Twin Peaks. But then I'm like, wow, I really love a lot of this. And so it was like, this interesting kind of development into being like, okay, yeah, I like what this is, where this is going. I like what this does and how different it is.
I find that David Lynch is like the king of making you feel like anvil heavy dread. In almost everything he does, like there's
Yeah.
this dread that permeates the whole thing. And
Mhm.
you kind of wish, like I could see why when you first watched David Lynch you had that reaction. It was probably a very visceral reaction
Mhm.
because it affected you on an unconscious level and
Yeah.
you didn't know what to make of it.
Yeah. And like I said, I took Blue Velvet so at face value, not understanding that it's a very dark fairy tale, because
Mhm.
even the ending has a very fairy tale feel. And so, like, when I went back and watched it again, I understood, and I'd seen more of his work, so it was like more in context. And it was like, okay, I have a totally different opinion of this now. And so, and somebody I know just wrote that to this day, David Lynch's highest grossing movie is still his version of Dune. None of his movies have ever made much money. I just
Yeah.
want to bring that up because as writers, many of us do not make as much money as we want. But just look at it this way, David Lynch has plenty of influence, even though he may not have ever had a big box office hit.
Yeah.
I was stunned that Mulholland Drive didn't do better because I remember when it came out, I think I was still a teenager at the time, but I remember it was critically acclaimed. People loved it, but it just didn't
Mhm.
make much money. And I feel like it's had like a long life of people still appraising it and talking about it. But yeah, it just didn't make a lot of money, which shocked me. And Lost Highway was a huge flop, which I did not know
Yeah.
until very recently.
That
If you
honestly
would have asked me, I would have been like, oh, I'm sure that movie made money. And no, it did not. And it was actually fairly maligned, even critically, which is weird because I feel like it's so quintessentially David Lynch. So yeah,
absolutely, yeah.
yeah.
I think David Lynch, is more of like a even though seeing his movies in the theater would be the ultimate experience, I think he's more of like a straight to video type cult, fan base. Like most people
Mhm.
who would watch people who are from suburbia, like your typical average person would watch that and be like, what the hell was that? Like,
Mhm.
what did I just
Mhm.
watch? Because I
Yeah.
feel like I should shower for an hour now and maybe vomit the contents of my stomach because everything needs to be cleansed.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so true. It's so true.
Uh, Katrina says, "My first David Lynch was Eraserhead, and it was by accident. It was life-changing." Yeah,
I like that. Life changing is a good way to describe Eraserhead. It kind of shifted the idea for me as to what a movie could do or what a movie could
absolutely.
be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, my first was Mulholland Drive, and, I
Yeah.
fell in love with it.
Hmm. Hmm.
Lydia. Hi, Lydia. How you doing? She says, David Lynch cooks quinoa is my favorite short of his, but that's stunning about Dune, especially
Yeah,
since it's not his own favorite. And you're right, Lydia. Actually, I believe he's sort of disowned it
I think
in a
so.
sense. He's
Yeah.
like, I don't want any part of that. That thing.
Yeah.
Bleh."
Yeah. Yeah, it made the most money. Now, I will say that because I actually went and looked, I think, at every David Lynch film. I'm pretty sure. Like I was looking at Wikipedia, and like you go down to that little box, and it's like budget and how much box office. I do think the bigger hit, technically, is Eraserhead because I think it's made several $1 million and only cost 700,000 or something. And over the course of its whole like midnight run and everything, it made more money than any of his other movies. It was probably his quote unquote biggest hit in terms of like how much it cost to how much it made. But in terms of how much box office, Dune I think made 30 or 40 million. It was a flop. It did not make its, I think it barely made its money back or didn't make its money back. But like
Yeah.
it made more money than anything else he's ever done, which is yeah, it
I
really is
I
very
think his
stunning.
name kinda goes with Dune too because he did that movie, and I think that's probably one reason why he doesn't want anything to do with it because, people talk about it all the time and how much they don't understand it.
Yeah, yeah. I that one is one that like I don't know that I'll ever rewatch it, but I'm glad I saw it because it is so weird. And I love people who follow me on social media have already heard this, but like I love the weird scene with the rat cat apparatus where there's like a
Yeah.
cat and the rat is taped to it and they have to milk the rat cat in order to like not die from some poison. And it's not in the book. It's just
Mhm.
some random thing they invented for it. And I love the rat cat. And then I don't know if somebody told me this or I found it. I can't remember now. But there was a Sting action figure released in the 80s that came with a little rat cat. And so I tracked it down on eBay and I'm like, whatever, Sting action figure. Like he sits over somewhere else, but the rat cat sits on my writing desk. It's this tiny little itty bitty thing and it sits on my writing desk because I think it's the most absurd thing. And it's this weird scene. And like I said, I love that this movie's an adaptation and this is nowhere in the books. I'm sure it's not in that new version of Dune because I made the joke with that was coming out. I'm like, it's not going to have the rat cat, so I want nothing to do with this version of Dune.
Yeah, yeah. That's awesome, though. I can't believe you were able to track something like that down.
I feel like with the internet, you can track so many weird things down. Like
You're right,
that's like
yeah.
if you're devoted over a period of time, you'll find
Yeah,
something
you'll
weird that
find it,
like will
yeah.
turn up at some point. That somebody's like getting it out of their grandma's basement or attic, and it's like
Yeah,
got this weird Sting action figure with a rat cat from Dune. Let's put it on eBay.
yeah. That is so weird. That in itself is kinda Lynchian.
Right? It's true. That's so true.
Oh, alright, getting back to The Haunting of Velkwood, I really wanna talk about the characters because one thing I've really enjoyed, reading your work from, uh the Rust Maidens to this is your characters feel absolutely real for me. And there's one thing I've heard others talk about this and recently, but I wanted to mention it too, is that in the beginning, your characters almost start backwards from
Mhm.
where stories like a lot of stories will break people and they end broken, but we come to your characters with them being broken or
Mhm.
damaged. And throughout the course of the story or the problem within the plot itself, they tend to find a way to maybe not fix themselves, but at least find a way to cope. And
Yeah.
your stories tend to end on a hopeful note. And that's one
Mhm.
thing I really love about your stories. Um, like, is this something you intentionally try to do, or do you think maybe it's just part of your own psychology?
I probably both, honestly. Like I feel like especially when I first started writing, it just kind of naturally went in that direction. And then now I feel like that's something that I do like as being a hallmark of my work. And yes, I would completely agree that very often you kind of come into a story and it's like, okay, these are normal, happy people, and then the story breaks them. But it usually my characters have a lot of trauma. They have a lot of grief. They are broken in some ways. And I like how you said that it's like learning how to cope one of the things I always say is it's not that my books necessarily have quote unquote happy endings. It's more that, they learn how to live with it. Whatever it is
Mhm.
that's happened, they've learned how to live with it in some way that they can move forward. And so that's something that I think a lot about trying to learn how to move forward from the things that happen to us, because, you know, everybody has grief. Everybody has something awful that has happened to them at some point, maybe several awful things, maybe many. And, learning how to live with that, I think, can be one of the hardest things, but it also can be one of the most meaningful.
Yes, absolutely. That's one reason why I appreciate, because, in retrospect, thinking about it, I think you're one of the only authors who actually, um, has this in their stories, like, consistently,
Yeah.
and, that's one reason why I love it is because it kind of provides a positive message, and, like, what you said in reference to what I said, is about learning to cope, it's not about
Mhm.
fixing, and I think that's if
Mhm.
there's one really big life lesson that we should all learn is that you can't go back to where you were before the bad thing happened, you just have to learn how to accept it and be kinder to yourself, basically.
Yes, yes, those are very much words to live by, and I think that's a lot of it, of being kinder to ourselves and realizing, yeah, you can't go back. You can't go back to that moment before whatever happened to you happened. And that's a lot of the story. Even though she physically goes back to this neighborhood, a lot of it is learning, like, maybe I can't fix this, or maybe I can, but not in the way I thought. And that can be a huge thing in life. We can get very attached to this is how I want to fix this. And it's like, it's not going to be fixed like that. It's going to, you're going to have to learn how to live with what was broken, and putting those pieces back together.
Yes, absolutely. And the main character in The Haunting of Velkwood is no exception. We come to her, and she's not exactly the happiest person on the
No,
planet, right?
no.
Her name is Talitha, and I really enjoyed the relationship between Talitha and Billy, because there's
Brett,
oh, Brett, yeah, right. Sorry, Brett, not
you're
Billy.
fine. You're fine. I'm like, don't think there's a character named Billy. It's been a little while though
Yeah,
since
no, it's
I
definitely Brett. It's definitely Brett. You're right. I don't know where I got Billy from, but I really found their relationship quite touching. I love it when a book can capture that kind of. There's a longing between them,
Mhm. Mhm.
because there is a bisexual element to this
Yeah.
story.
Yeah.
Both Talitha and I believe Brett is also
Mhm.
bisexual.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
but I love it when a book can create that sort of longing that you do in this book. And I was wondering, uh, how were you able to accomplish this? Because that's something. If I were to ever say I like romance, it's when there's a longing when a character longs for someone, or at least maybe
Mhm.
even something that they can't
Mhm.
necessarily have until a
Mm.
certain situation has been resolved.
Yeah, I'm not I wish I had some, like, great answer for this, but I'm not really sure. It feels almost like, in drafting it, it's kind of trial and error of what's working, what's not working, what would I wanna see if I was watching the story play out or reading the story. I often see things as movies in my head. I think I already said I have a background in filmmaking, so a lot of times that's kind of where I go. And so, like, if I were watching this as a movie or reading this in a book, like, what would I want to see? And it often is that longing, because that creates such tension between people. And it's not, this easy gratification. It's something that takes longer and it's more difficult. And, you know, to me, it's more interesting. So that's always what I'm trying to think of, is make something as interesting as I can, that I would be entertained by.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that. Um, I was wondering though, on like a technical level, because I mean, you've been quite open about your own bisexuality, um, so I don't necessarily want to intrude on that, but I do want to know, as a straight person myself, how does a writer who's straight approach writing
Hmm.
LGBTQ characters without getting themselves canceled? Because it seems like a two-way highway. If you don't, you could get canceled because they never, the writer never includes it, or you could do it
Mhm.
completely wrong,
Mhm.
and you get like in a lot of trouble because you did it without, any sensitivity readers or anything like that.
I mean, sensitivity readers are one way to do it. But even then, I think there's also the fact that, if people still don't like it, you can't fall back on the sensitivity reader and blame them, right? So I think the main thing is, for me, I feel like I can tell, and I think a lot of readers can tell if they want to, the difference between somebody who's kind of going into it with good faith and really is trying, and maybe sometimes they miss a few points or something, as opposed to somebody who's just doing it to be salacious. I think that that is where it can get kind of frustrating. As a queer person, it's like, oh, you're doing like a stereotype, like, because bisexuality is often they're greedy or they're confused. If you're doing that with your character, that probably lacks the sensitivity, especially if you're writing it as a straight person, because even writing it as a queer person, you can kind of get yourself into a little bit of a place where you're going to irritate other queer people, even if you're writing from your own experience, if you're using tropes. But for me, I think the other thing is you're not going to please everybody. There's always going to be somebody who's not going to like what you do, no matter what, no matter how many sensitivity readers you get, or no matter how you really do try to keep everything in mind. For me, I'm not big into cancel culture. Like, I've never been the person that's like, by and large, every once in a while I've gotten mad about something on social media, but like, I don't think I've ever really participated in that for the most part, unless the person's abusive, right? Like, that's
Mhm.
not cancel culture to me. That's saying, this
Yeah.
person has abused people in the community.
Yeah.
But in terms of, I think as long as somebody's approaching it with good faith, and you can tell that, and they are engaging with it, I think it's a fairly safe, place. And if people don't like it and you get a lot of feedback or reviews not liking it, take that into consideration when you write queer characters in the future. For me, we're all trying our best here, and again, if you're coming at it from a positive place and you're not trying to be exploitive or mean-spirited or anything, even if you don't get it right, just learn from it and keep going. Because I think we're all learning both, our craft, both at a technical level and then also just as people. We can all learn more about ourselves and about each other. So that's where I come from it.
Yeah. Um, on this topic, one reason why I asked this, because I'm not the only writer who's like, "Oh, how do I approach this?" I know there's other writers too who are nervous about doing it, but there's writers who have spoken out about this, and they've said some things that could be taken as controversial. And I wanted to get your thoughts on this.
Ooh.
Wrath James White, he's an extreme horror writer,
Mhm.
and he's also a person of color. And he
Mhm.
says, like, don't worry about the tropes. Just have colored people, have gay people in your stories, because it's more important for them to be there than to not be there. So
Mhm.
he's talking about, and he said this on his TikTok, that if you want to have your bad guy as a black guy, then do it. If you want your bad guy as a good guy, then do it. It doesn't matter, just so long as they're there. What do you think of that?
I think, and again, especially if you're coming at it from good faith, I think that's very good advice, because, as long as you're not coming at it as like, oh, I want to have a person of color who's a bad guy, and you really want to just do that because you think that way about people of color, or you want to have a bad, your villain be queer because that's how, again, that's going to come across in some way. But I feel like as long as you're coming at it with good faith, I agree, have fun with it and go with it. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think there's also you're seeing a shift too
Mhm.
in the so-called villain, the way villains are written today. Before they were, it was black and white, good guy wearing the white hat and the bad guy wearing the black hat.
Yeah.
Now everyone seems to wear gray. You might have like a more of a moral ground where the good guy is sitting on, but oftentimes I think the best villains are the ones who have a really good reason for the terrible things
Mhm.
they're doing.
Yeah. Yeah. I would agree with that a lot. I think that that's always more interesting when you have these multidimensional antagonists that do have motivations that we can see, because that's scarier, right? If we can be like, oh, I can relate to that in some way, that is something that I think can make it scarier.
Yeah, one book that did that really well was Revival by Stephen King. I don't know
Okay.
if
I
you've read that.
don't think so.
It's really like the bad guy in that book. You don't even know he's the bad guy until halfway, but you totally understand
Ooh.
why he's doing what he's doing. It's
Yeah.
one of Stephen King's best bad guys or antagonists, and you get it kind of attached to the bad guy, and that's the type of thing I really look for in fiction these
Mhm.
days.
Mhm.
And going back to your characters, I wanted to talk a little bit about Sophie. She's the little 8-year-old sister. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah.
I really enjoyed her storyline. I felt for
Mhm.
her, and nobody like because I've been tracking like uh, interviews and whatnot that you've been having, and nobody's really talking about Sophie too much.
No, as soon as
Um,
you brought her up, I'm like, oh, I haven't gotten to talk about Sophie yet. Like nobody's asked about Sophie.
Yeah, I love Sophie. Like I've really felt for Sophie, and that's why I think I kind of fell in love with her. And I was talking about longing before. She
Mhm,
has a real sense of longing that
mhm,
is what really drove me. There's some things she says near the end that made my heart bleed for her.
mhm.
It's I find it kind of weird that nobody talks about her, despite her being Talitha's driving motivation within the book.
Yeah, yeah, in a lot of ways, she's kind of almost like an inciting incident, in Talitha wanting to go back. And so, yeah, I think she fills a different kind of role in the plot than a lot of times kids are, about. I think she's a lot of times when you have an 8-year-old, it's usually your main character's child or the other, your main character is also a child. But to have it be like, Talitha is 40 and her little sister is 8 because her little sister is trapped in this neighborhood. It's a dynamic that's kind of, not one that you necessarily see that big of an age difference and under these circumstances very often. So, yeah, and I think that Talitha and Brett's relationship is still, a big focus of the book, but I do think that Talitha, wanting to save Sophie, wanting to be there for Sophie and missing Sophie and Sophie missing Talitha so much is absolutely a big driving force of the book as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and they cling to each other
Mhm.
very hard to
Mhm.
the point where they're harming
Mhm.
the other. Or at least they're threatening to harm the other with what's going on inside the street, and I found that a
Yes.
very interesting dynamic. Like, you
Yes.
care about somebody so much that you're holding on
Mhm.
to them that you could accidentally hurt them, and
Mhm.
it almost doesn't matter because they're with you.
Mhm. Yes. Yes. And the idea that you can love someone so much, but maybe you can't help them is something that's a very potent idea for me and something that, you can bring the best intentions to something, but sometimes you're not able to save someone for a variety of reasons. And Talitha has to kind of wrestle with that of how much can she help Sophie? And like you said, and how much is she hurting other people by trying to save Sophie? So
Yeah.
yeah.
I really enjoyed that aspect. I also wanted to talk a little bit about Jack. Speaking of bad guys, I thought he was going to be one. When I first read about Jack, I immediately didn't trust him. I even wrote down in my notes, "I don't trust that guy."
I love that. I
But
love that.
yeah, but by the end, I really, without spoiling anything, I really grew to enjoy his presence, and of course the researchers.
Yes.
I really enjoyed their presence too. I like kind of how the researchers were in a sense, all one person,
Mhm.
and I
Mhm.
I found that an interesting choice. You didn't really flesh them out, like they didn't need to be. They were just the researchers, and they were there, and they
Mhm.
kind of became a bit of an antagonist themselves because
Mm.
they didn't go along with what Jack wanted. They were just all
Yes.
about the job, and they didn't care about
Yeah.
the people involved very much.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, so Jack is the researcher that approaches Talitha at the very beginning, very first page of the book, and carries throughout. He's the one who is researching the Velkwood vicinity or Velkwood Street. And he's the one who convinces her to come back, and she's trying to get her sister out and everything. And there is this group of researchers that, like, they introduce themselves to Talitha, but Talitha has very bad social skills. So she can't really, like, she doesn't remember anybody's name. And they're always, like you said, they're this antagonistic force because they're all business. They're all just about getting this done and researching it. I personally also saw them as this kind of like very darkly comedic kind of comedy relief
They
at
kind of
times
were
because
though,
it's
yeah.
so bizarre and she's interacting with these people and yeah, and so to me, it was kind of like this very strange, again, like a David Lynch movie where there's this weird thing that happens that's kind of darkly funny, but also very uncomfortable at the same time. And that was kind of like the tension I was trying to bring with the researchers. That it's very uncomfortable and they're not very nice to Talitha. And Talitha isn't always nice to them. Like she's not real, courteous either. But there's also this sense of how absurd it all is that, this is Because one of the things I often think when I'm writing horror, reading horror, is there are absurd situations oftentimes. There are things that a regular person is never going to deal with: a haunted house, probably, right? Or a vampire or a werewolf or any of our tropes. And sometimes to me, it's fun to kind of bring in that absurd element because it is naturally absurd to the human experience. So it's kind of fun to bring in a little bit of that kind of odd comedy to sort of be like, yes, this is weird. This is a very weird thing. There's no normal way of, getting into this ghost neighborhood. It's always going to be weird. If this actually happened in the real world, this would always be bizarre. This would never be this normal thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of ghosts, going into uh, the street of Velkwood, it's populated by ghosts, but I really enjoyed the way you approached this. I don't know how to go about going into the street without spoiling it too much, because I think once you get in there, that's where the fun really starts to begin, and because that's where it gets strange and that's where it
Mhm.
gets surreal, and it doesn't just get surreal when you're inside the town or the street. When they come back out, things start getting weird too.
Mhm.
Um, I really enjoyed that. Like I This book is so good.
Oh,
But,
thank you.
but I just wanna know, like, how did you come to, because if I was to write this story myself, I would get stuck, once we enter the street. I'd be like, "Okay, so what happens now? How do we make this, and how did you approach creating the ghosts? Because the ghosts is a very interesting, intricate part of what's going on in this story, especially with the main plot, like the main problem that's going on between is with Talitha and Brett and what happened in their past.
Yeah, yeah. And, I think, especially when she initially goes into the neighborhood, I was just excited, sort of as the author, to explore it. And so, kind of thinking about it in that regard. Again, I always like come at horror as a fan, I think, almost first and foremost. So it's kind of like, okay, if I was watching this or reading this, what would I want to see? And so, kind of going along with that of exploring this neighborhood, and each time she goes in, something different happens. And so it's like really playing with that, and exploring, how can you make each visit different, how can you make the houses different, and how can you kind of develop these ghosts in a way that's very surreal but also feels consistent with who these people were when they were alive or before whatever happened. Because that's actually something that's interesting that has come up: is, are they really ghosts? That's sort of a question that is asked throughout. Are they dead? Are they ghosts? What are they? Because, yeah, that is a big thing. And even within the book, of like, is this, just a weird anomaly and they're just trapped inside not aging,
Yes,
or are they
exactly.
ghosts? And honestly, I leave that kind of open-ended enough that, um it could be either way. I feel like that's up for the reader to interpret. I'm good whatever somebody wants to say. I have my opinion, but, like, I feel like you could say they're not ghosts at the end of it, or you could say, yeah, they're definitely ghosts.
And you
So
also start to wonder maybe who are the ghosts and who's
mhm.
real, because
Yeah.
once you go in there, it's
Mhm.
they're living their own life in a sense, right? And
Yeah.
um
Yeah.
and but there's at least a couple of times in the book where I'm just like, is everything I'm reading real, or
Yeah.
is this going to be like the others type
Oh,
of thing happening
yeah.
here?
Yeah.
But I'm not going to spoil it. Everyone's going to have to read it to find out exactly what's going on once you enter the street of Velkwood. Um, so I heard that you you've said that writing Velkwood took a little bit of a toll on you, and when you were done writing it, you had to take a bit of a break and you concentrated on short stories for a little bit.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, it was a very intense experience, writing this book, and really mining some of the personal experiences I had with my sexuality, with coming out, with it not going well when I was younger, and with really coming back around to it as an adult, and in a kind of safer point in my life of being like, yeah, I have to deal with this. I do have to, I mean, I was already dealing with it a lot in my writing anyways. And so it really came to the point I'm like, yeah, I need to be publicly out and, talking about this, because it really was the realization also that a lot of people don't talk about bisexuality. It's sort of a thing that, kind of there's a lot of bi erasure, and, people don't kind of see it as something that needs to be talked about. And then once I decided, yes, I need to come out, I need to talk about this publicly. I'm writing bisexual characters anyways, it's already in my work. And then realizing that there's been a lot of research done, epidemiological research that, people who are bisexual have terrible health outcomes because there's, this kind of, they call it like the minority stress model, because being bisexual is an oppressed identity, and oftentimes even within, this is less true now. I want to say this first and foremost, but when I was growing up, bisexuality, nobody liked you if you were bisexual. Straight people didn't like you, the queer community didn't like you. That's not really true anymore. I don't see that almost ever now. That's
That's
very
right.
rare. So it's like, but I very much grew up with, even knowing queer people who were like, no, nobody likes bisexuals. And so there I am, like, not out at that point, and being like, okay, there's really no one safe to discuss this with. And so how much that takes a toll on people's health, mental health, physical health. And so it was then like, okay, so I do want to talk about this. And that was, I've done, some writing about it, and then also I put together the very first ever bisexuality and horror panel at StokerCon last year, and so that was really a fantastic time just to have a conversation with other bisexual authors. And so really trying to be that person, kind of talking about it publicly now, especially after so many years of not talking about it. So yeah, but after I finished Velkwood, I'm close to finishing a couple of longer works of fiction, but I actually still haven't finished a novel since then. And I haven't even, so it's been an interesting thing. And that's been almost 2 years. And it's like, I feel like in this industry, you're expected to have a new book every 6 months to a year. And I'm like, I had to take some time. I've written lots of short fiction, lots of short nonfiction. So it's like, I've definitely been busy, but I needed to take some time before I kind of went and wrote another novel, because it was just like, even a novella, I'm almost done with a novella. So I'm hoping to have that ready soon.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was like I needed to just take some time and be like, okay, this book kind of like reconfigured a lot of things in my life. So yeah, it's interesting when your own writing does that, when you're like, whoa, this went in a direction I didn't think it was going to.
Yeah. The tone is different too from your work,
Mhm.
like from your previous stories. I would say if in tonally, it's mostly connected to your first book, The
Yeah,
Rust Maidens. It has that same sort of tone to it,
yeah,
that mood. But
yeah.
this one I would say is even darker. Um,
Mhm.
and it's like completely different from what Reluctant Immortals was. Reluctant Immortals was, although it had a lot of really great messages in there,
Mhm.
um,
It
it
was a
was a
lot
lot more, it was
fun.
more upbeat, yeah, and fun.
Yes. Yes, I agree. I really did with that one. It was, there's a lot of messages about, female empowerment and standing up against abusers, but I still always describe that one as like my feminist Hammer film. Like when
Yeah,
I was writing that,
absolutely.
I'm like, I want to write a feminist Hammer movie. That's like what I want to write. And so that was very much the tone of it. It's like a road movie. It's like a road story. It's like a road trip story. And it's like, because they like drive up and down the coast of California, and it's got all like the psychedelics, and
Yeah.
it's a fun book. Even though it does have its dark moments, it's much more fun. Like if somebody were to come to me and be like, I like something moody, I'd say Velkwood. If somebody's like, I really want fun horror that's more like an adventure story, that's going to be Reluctant Immortals, not Velkwood. And I'm not trying to not sell Velkwood, but you have different moods anyways as a reader, right? So it's like, if you want something more fun, that's going to be Reluctant Immortals. If you want something darker, creepier, more atmospheric, that's definitely going to be The Haunting of Velkwood.
Yeah. I like I like both, honestly,
Thank
but,
you.
like, this book really came at, like, a special, like, I wouldn't say a special time, but it came at the right time when I was reading
Mhm.
it. Remember after, like, first 10 or 15 pages, I was just like, "Okay, man, I'm in." You know what I mean? Like, and, I finished it in, like, less than a week, and it was just like, "Wow, this is so good." But I really enjoyed, Reluctant Immortals too. I finished that one really quick too. Maybe it's just the way you write, and maybe it's not a coincidence, it's just that you're able to pull me in, with pretty much everything you write. I really enjoyed your short stories too, that I've read. Um,
Yeah.
I read your collection, but the name is escaping me right now. It's,
Oh yeah, it's that long, the long title, and the
yeah, and
smell into the universe. Yeah.
yeah, that's it. That was really good too. I really enjoyed that. And speaking of short stories, you have a short story, a new short story coming in. soon. It's called Five Deleted Scenes from Vampiro Lamia.
Yeah.
Soon to be released with Euroschlock Nightmares. Can you give us a glimpse about what that story is about and what is Euroschlock?
So it's an anthology, and they're all inspired by like European horror from like the 70s. So like, Mario Bava and Jess Franco, and a lot of those different kind of really interesting, unusual art films from that era. And so it was great because I had watched a lot of those types of movies recently, anyways, because I was doing a presentation on bisexuality and like vampires. And so there's a lot of bisexuality and vampires in some of those. And then I was approached to write a story for the anthology, and I was like, okay, I've got to do like a bisexual vampire story that's like, this kind of lost movie, because I always love writing about cinema. The title story in my collection is like told from a perspective of this big fan of this dead actress, and like how I love film because it can make, again, with time, it can make time feel like it stopped. You can watch a movie that's 50, now almost 100 years old now, and it still feels new. It still feels fresh. It almost feels like you can kind of reach into the past. And I love playing with that idea with cinema. And so that's something I do with this story that's coming out, now as well. And yeah, and I was thinking about the actress Soledad Miranda, I think I'm saying her name right, who was just lovely. She played Lucy in Jess Franco's version of Dracula. It was one of the few times I think that Christopher Lee played Dracula and it wasn't a Hammer movie. And it's a great, like Klaus Kinski is Renfield in it. It's a great version. And Soledad Miranda is just a lovely version of Lucy. I love her in it, but she died real young in a car crash, I believe. It was real sad. She was in her 20s, I think. And she was still acting. She was doing, a lot of different interesting work. And it was really, I feel like it was just such a loss. And so I was thinking about her when I was writing this, about like this kind of lost actress and this lost film. So yeah, that's like kind of a preview for that one. I'm really excited about that anthology. That looks like a lot of fun. I can't wait to read the other stories.
That anthology sounds great. I've got her. Do you know when it's going to be released?
I'm not sure. I know later this year. I know they're doing the pre-order now, maybe this summer. Wish I could say right off the top of my head. I feel bad. It's just like, I feel like my brain has been mush lately. And it's always terrible when people ask you questions about your own books and stuff, and you're like, I don't remember. I feel like I didn't do the required reading.
Well, it's not easy to find because I looked for it and I can't find the release date, but I have seen the pre-orders on the website itself, but there's like
Yeah.
nothing on Amazon or anything like that.
Actually looking to see if it says anything. June is sticking in my head, but I could be very wrong about that. Oh yeah, there's the cover. Yay.
I love the cover too. The
Yeah, the
cover is
cover's
really
really
good.
neat. Yeah, I don't see pre-orders are shipped in advance.
It could
Yeah,
be
no.
still be to be determined.
Yeah, that might
Yeah.
be it. But June for some reason is sticking in my head. So we'll go with that unless I find something different. But yeah. Oren Gray, Sam Richard. I think Krista Carmen is in there. Yes, Krista is in there. Tiffany Morris. So yeah, and
Yeah.
edited by Jonathan Rabb. So Muzzleland Press is where that's coming out. So yeah. So Jess Franco, Dario Argento, Mario Bava, Lucio Fulci. Might be mispronouncing some of those names. It's always weird when you have these filmmakers that you've known for years, but like you've never heard them pronounced for whatever reason. And then you're like, oh no, am I saying these names right? But
Yeah. I know exactly what you mean. It's like with Billy and Brett.
you're fine.
So I did want to inquire while I have you here, because you have been writing a lot of short stories. Are we going to see another short story collection from you?
I definitely hope so. That's definitely something that I'm hoping to do in the next couple of years. Yeah, that's really a big thing that's like on my agenda. I haven't put together anything yet, but like I've kind of got ideas swirling in my head, and yeah, I would definitely want to have some new work in there. So that's a matter of, figuring out what stories I want in there, like what kind of theme I would want for it, and then writing the new material and finding a publisher, of course. That's always a big thing.
Yeah.
But yeah. So hopefully in the next 2 years, that's my goal. who knows, right? Publishing is weird. I would never have imagined it would be 7 years before I'd have another collection, because the first collection came out almost 7 years ago. I never expected to go this long, but it just kind of evolved that way. And it's like, okay.
Time slips between the fingers,
Yes, it does.
it doesn't
Yes, it
matter how
does.
hard you hold on to it to
Mhm,
just
mhm.
stay for a little bit.
Yeah, it's so true. It's so true.
Speaking of collections, though, you write a lot of essays. Like, this isn't the first essay I've talked to you about. When you were on the Vestarian panel that I hosted a year or so ago, we were talking about an essay that you wrote for Vestarian.
Yes.
So, do you think we could ever see, or at least maybe have some, if not have some of those essays threaded within short stories? Do you think we could have like a, a collection of your essays, the collected essays?
That is, yeah, that's even more in the future. But like, I have thought about that, about doing like a nonfiction. If I could again figure out a way to kind of put them all together that it would make sense. And yeah, that is something like a nonfiction collection. I think
Yeah.
would be really interesting, because I love writing nonfiction.
I
I
like
do
I
it.
like Gwendolyn Kiste, the collected essays.
Yes. Oh my gosh, that sounds so
Yeah.
wonderfully pretentious. I love that. Oh my gosh, yes.
That would be awesome, though. Uh,
It would. It would be fun.
so Alex says, always good to see authors interviewed. Thank you, Jason, for this opportunity. You're welcome, Alex.
Thank you for
Um,
watching.
so before we go, is there anything else that you'd like to plug before we head off into Never Neverland?
Just Haunting of Velkwood. That's my baby. That's my ghostly baby right
It's the
now.
cover
Yes,
right
there
there,
it is. Yay.
and it
Yeah. And so, pick up a copy. There's audiobook. There's where'd that little weird thing come
that it
from?
was like a thumb. I think somebody gave it a thumbs down.
Somebody not like the cover? Maybe somebody's like, no, I don't like that cover.
Maybe they don't like the way I'm holding it. I don't know. It's like your fingers are covering up the title, jerk.
Yeah, and so yeah, just pick that up. It's on audiobook. It's on paper. No, it's actually not on paperback yet. Paperback next year. Hardcover right now. And you're so used to my stuff always being paperback. And then ebook. So yeah, you can pick it up.
Awesome. Well, congratulations on the release of that.
Yeah.
And thanks again for getting me an ARC and Typical Books. Lydia, she says, so excited to read this. Love the cover, and I think you're gonna love it, Lydia. I'm more than certain it's gonna make my top 10 at the end of the year,
Oh, thank you.
whatever that means. But it's definitely, I think, gonna be up there somewhere. Where can people find you? I know you're not on Twitter anymore. You decided to abandon Twitter, which
Yes, I left Twitter. It was too much for too
yeah,
long.
I
So yeah, I'm on Instagram and I'm on Facebook. You can find me under my name, Gwendolyn Kiste. And then I've got a blog and on my website, so gwendolynkeist.com. And I've also got a newsletter if you want to keep up with me like that. Maybe send it out like once a month or so. Probably not even that often, but at least one, no more than once a month. I will not be
yeah.
spamming anyone if you're interested in signing up for my newsletter.
I have to applaud you for leaving Twitter because I tried to do that about 6 months ago, and I just couldn't do it. I ended up
Mhm.
going back.
I spent a long time thinking about it and like conditioning myself for it. It was like I felt like it was training for a marathon. I realized in basically April when I knew, that guy who bought it was going to buy it. And I
Yeah,
remember hearing it on the radio that it was going to go through. And I remember being like, all right, you need to start really like conditioning yourself for that possibility. So it was like 6 to 8 months of preparing myself to leave. And it was, by the time I did, it was fine. But I feel like if I would have just left, it would have been a lot more abrupt. So it was like, okay, I've got to like, get contact information for people that I want to talk to, or, follow them elsewhere and do all of these things. And it was
yeah,
a process. Like we get very involved in our social media, whether we want to or not.
we
It
do. Well,
involves us. It's sentient.
it keeps you informed, and that's the reason
It
why I
does.
end up
Yeah.
going back because I realized I
Yeah.
wasn't learning the things that I was learning before, and I was like, God damn it, I got to go back.
Yeah, and there is that. There's definitely things I'm sure I've missed, news wise, because it is easier to get news there. And I do try to like keep up with things, but there are other things. And then just even in the industry and in horror in general, like I do think sometimes I'm missing things, and that is sad. And I do feel that loss sometimes, but it's like, I'm still happier overall, so I still think
Yeah.
it's, a
I
win.
mean, it can be a very toxic place, and I find
Mhm.
it's become even more toxic since certain
That's what
so and
I've
so took
heard.
it over.
Yeah.
Like a lot of arguing and stuff, like political
Yeah.
arguments over stuff that's
Mhm.
not even, you say, I woke up hungry this morning, and next thing you know, there's you're being flooded with like negative comments.
Yeah.
That's a terrible analogy, but it's basically kind of the way it can
Yeah, but
become. Yeah.
it is a place where people like to fight more so than Instagram or Facebook. Facebook
Yeah.
people fight, but not like on Twitter. And then Instagram doesn't even really set itself up for fights. It's really hard
No,
to fight on Instagram. It's just like, what are
it
you going to
is.
do?
Yeah.
Yell at somebody's picture? Like
Yeah.
it's a lot. It's just not made to kind of keep those fights going either. So it's like, it's not a very combative. But there's problems with Instagram too. It's not a utopia by any
No.
stretch, but like it's just the fighting doesn't seem to happen there quite as often.
Are you on any of the new platforms that have popped up since someone took over Twitter, like Threads or Blue Sky?
Not yet. I'm open to being on Blue Sky at some point, just kind of letting it play out for now. The thought of having three social media is a lot. I mainly did Facebook and Twitter before, and then I had an Instagram that I didn't use very often. So it's like, having three, I think, is just a lot to manage.
Yeah, it
So like
is.
I like
I,
two better.
I'm on all of them, and it is like there's most of them end up getting ignored because there's only a few
Mhm.
that I stick to.
Yeah,
I stick to the ones that are busy because that's where I get my information and whatnot. And
that makes sense.
yeah, well, thank you so much for coming on the show. I had a blast talking with you, and you're always welcome to come back anytime.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. This was so much fun.
And I want to thank everyone who showed up and asked or commented and asked questions. Thank you. And we will talk again soon.
All right, sounds good.